Welcome to IVF This, episode 39, The Emotional Rollercoaster. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. I'm a mother to two beautiful and feral boys. I'm married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello and welcome, my friends. I'm going to get straight into today's topic, which is something I think that every single one of us has experienced during our journey. Whether you're doing fertility treatments or not, the roller coaster pretty much starts like after the first few months and you've been trying and it's not working, or maybe you're moving straight into treatments because of a diagnosis or a genetic reason or something like that. It doesn't matter when or how, but we've probably all said something to the effect of, this is such a roller coaster. Man, I have been saying that to myself over the past 9 days for sure. I'm not immune to this stuff just because I'm your coach. I always try to remind you that you have a human brain, and so do I. We are all messy, beautiful humans together. The reason I'm on the roller coaster is because tomorrow I go for my beta. This is the last day that I will know if our little baby implanted or not. And believe me when I tell you that I have had all of the emotions the last 9 days. Fear, anxiety, anger, resentment, hopelessness, hopefulness, excitement. I mean, all of them. Name it. I've had it. I felt it vibrate through my body at some point, as we all do. And I want to say this because I love to remind you that I am no different. Like, I know that I coach on this stuff all day long, but I am just as susceptible to the bullshittery of my thoughts as you guys are. I've been texting my best friend Rach all throughout the days, nights, early mornings with texts of absolute dread, crippling fear, gut-wrenching sorrow, and unbridled excitement. All of it. I've been down the Dr. Google rabbit hole and symptom spotting like an early pregnancy sleuth. I've wept. I've walked the baby section at department stores to feel closer to the baby. I've convinced myself more times that I can count that I am in fact pregnant, and then convinced myself that I am not. I have feared not being pregnant and the grief that will come with that for me and our family. And in some ways, I've also feared being pregnant. Why is that, Emily? You might be asking yourself, because anyone who has ever been pregnant for any amount of time, you know that once you get that positive, you aren't all of a sudden absolved of never feeling fear or anxiety again. Oh no, my friends, it morphs into something different. Now, you'll hold your breath when you go to the bathroom because you'll be afraid that you see blood. You will worry about every single twinge and cramp. It doesn't stop when you finally get pregnant. It just changes. So it's possible to feel a tad bit of relief in that moment, or fear that you might actually be, and what that could mean for you. And if that's you, I see you. It's normal, it's valid, and it certainly doesn't mean anything about you or your desire to get, be, or stay pregnant. It is a thought that we have. So I'm doing all of this and more, and this is what we often refer to as the emotional roller coaster, the ups and downs. The reason why I wanted to talk about this today, other than it being incredibly topical for me, is that I think a lot of us spend time resisting the downs and maybe even emotionally cushioning the ups. But there is another aspect that is hardly ever talked about in general, but certainly not in reference to infertility, and that is the aspect of anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is defined by grief that occurs before any great loss. Most often it is talked about, or I should say when it's talked about, because grief in general is rarely openly discussed, but when it's talked about, it's around terminal or end-of-life care. Many loved ones of terminally ill patients often experience anticipatory grief, but that's not the only time. You can experience it when you leave or dissolve a relationship, change jobs, relocating, and of course, going through a retrieval or a transfer. During these times of waiting and uncertainty, right, waiting after your retrieval to find out how many fertilized and then how many make it to blast. If you're doing genetic testing, then there's even more waiting. And then, of course, the wait from transfer to beta. Anticipatory grief is a big part of this. Let me give you an example from just this past week for me. This was probably around the 36-hour post-transfer mark for me. My husband was out of town, and it was after bedtime. I was laying in bed and I was watching a show on Netflix. All of a sudden, I thought it didn't work. And I was overcome with grief, like heaving sobs. You know that kind of cry? The kind that comes from your soul. I was experiencing anticipatory grief. That guttural ache of your soul when you feel like you have lost or are losing something. That's what happened. I want to say I cried for about 10 minutes. I cried so hard and physically that I fell asleep afterwards. But it wasn't until the next day, until I was on the other side of that grief burst, that I was able to identify and name what had happened. Has that ever happened to you? A grief burst? You're just kind of standing around or watching TV, maybe you're doing some shopping, and this wave of grief crashes into you, almost like you're hit by a bus. That's called a grief burst. It's completely normal, and I would say a very expected part of this journey. I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent for a second because I think it's important to talk about grief and loss within this context. And I want to make sure that it's known that there are no qualifiers on grief. There are no boxes that you have to tick and get to say, yep, I'm allowed to feel grief now. Grief is an incredibly personal and individual experience. I used to tell myself that I wasn't allowed to feel grief about this journey because I've never experienced a miscarriage or pregnancy loss. But that's not true. There are many forms of loss on this journey. Miscarriage, pregnancy loss, failed cycles, failed transfer, and honestly, the loss of your expectation of being able to just have sex and get pregnant, the loss of how you thought this part of your life was going to go, that's a very real loss too. And it's okay to honor whatever your loss might look like. There's no right type of loss. There's no wrong type of loss. We are all experiencing loss in some form throughout this time. Now, back to the roller coaster. Personally, I'm sure I have experienced this thought of it didn't work in prior transfers and any of the other waiting that occurs, but this was the first time that I really sat down to think about what I was feeling. And again, this is the next day. I didn't get straight into thought work as soon as I wiped my tears and blew my nose. No, this was the next morning after I was a little bit more put together. I did some journaling. I identified some of the thoughts and feelings, and most importantly, I did not judge myself. That's the key, and that's the part that many of us get stuck on, the judgment. I didn't make it mean anything about me other than I had had the thought it didn't work. And then I experienced an emotion as a result of that thought, which is exactly the way it happens. When I thought it didn't work, then I immediately felt despair. And that's the best word I can use because it wasn't really hopelessness. It was utter despair. Now, for you, if you have that thought, you might experience anger. There's no right or wrong feeling that's attached to a thought. That's the beautiful thing about how this works. Again, it's incredibly individual and incredibly specific. Then a day later, hours later, even moments later, I would think it did work. I'm totally pregnant. And that thought would feel warm and happy. That's the emotional roller coaster, right? The ups and the downs. What I want to make sure we really know, driving this point home, is that neither one of those thoughts are more or less true than the other. Until I actually find out the number, and then the second beta, because my clinic checks 2 days later, each of those thoughts, it worked, and it didn't work are equally true. The important part is how I feel when I think that. You've probably heard me talk about being much less interested in if a thought is true or not than if the thought serves you or not. And we'll always know if a thought serves us by how it makes us feel. Now, I know that there are some of us that want to pee on all the sticks during the wait. Full disclosure about me, I've never really been a home tester. I think I did it for the first few months that we tried way back in 2012. Then there was a month that I tried ovulation prediction kits, but my ADD made that nearly impossible to stay focused on when I was supposed to test. So I've never been a big home tester for any of it. But I know that there are many of us out there that do, and that's not a problem. I think there are a lot of us that have this love-hate relationship with pregnancy tests. And this plays, I think, into the roller coaster that we experience. I think we kind of look at these things, these tests, as the creator or destroyer of our happiness. Not consciously, mind you, but I think subconsciously we absolutely do. It's almost as if we give the testing strip the power to tell us how we get to feel about ourselves, right? That's something I think we all do. And it's the reason that I stopped testing as early into my journey as I did, was that every time I had a negative, I was a complete asshole to myself. It was as if only having one line on the test strip just proved all of the worst things that I believed about myself and my life. But it literally is a strip of plastic, fabric, and whatever things are in there that we pee on. Another way I think this comes up for many of us is the scale. When we step on the scale and we see whatever number it is, it's rare in our day and age for us to feel good about stepping on the scale. Well, we might for a minute, and then all the thoughts about worthiness, good enoughness, and everything else starts pouring in. We stand on a scale, the scale shits out a number, and we beat the crap out of ourselves. It's not the scale. It's not the tests. Those are inanimate objects. Those are circumstances. The call is coming from inside the house. It's coming from your brains. So how do we manage the roller coaster? I'm going to be completely honest. We're not getting off the roller coaster. It's going to come. We don't have to fight it, but there is a way to manage it. So when my clients talk to me about the emotional roller coaster, I like to get really specific with them. I think the blanket term emotional roller coaster only serves to confuse ourselves, confuse how we're feeling. If we refer to it as the emotional roller coaster without taking time to suss out what we're actually feeling, then of course we're going to feel out of control. We don't really know what we're feeling. We're probably telling ourselves that we should feel differently. We're trying to resist the thoughts and feelings that don't feel comfortable. There's a great children's book called The Color Monster, and I would encourage all of you to read it. The premise of the book is that the color monster feels out of control because he isn't sure what he's feeling. So they have to separate out his feelings, one in each jar, until he knows what it is he's feeling in any given moment. I think as adults, we kind of dismiss the importance of understanding what we're actually feeling. Now, there's something to be said about the complexity of emotions that you feel as you develop, as you get older, right? When you're a little kiddo and you're angry, then they're angry until they feel differently. As an adult, you can be angry and grateful, right? It's not as binary. But when we don't stop to really check in with ourselves, then we just keep operating in this confused panic. We don't separate out our emotions. We can't address what we won't look at. So the first step is to stop. Literally stop. We get so used to powering through whatever it is we're doing, however it is we're feeling, and then we wonder why we're snapping at the people we love, we can't concentrate on things, we're binge eating the pantry at night. It's like we operate in a perpetual state of damage control, but it's not necessary. I know that for many of you, slowing down can feel dangerous. Like you don't know what you would be forced to confront should you slow down long enough for all of the crap you keep pushing down to surface. But I promise you, that crap is going to come up whether you want it to or not. If you don't acknowledge it, if you don't deal with it, then it's just going to wait for you. And the moment you let your guard down just a little, it's going to come roaring to the surface. And it's going to be like the force of Mount St. Helens eruption because you have spent so much time resisting it. Stopping and checking in with yourself doesn't have to be this laborious, time-consuming exercise that I think we kind of imagine it to be. This is what I do when I stop to check in with myself. I'll sit down wherever I can get a moment's quiet. So if that's the bathroom for you, do it. Sit down. I place my hand over my heart. I take a few deep breaths, 3 to 5, and I speak very, very lovingly to myself. Hey, love, what's going on? What are you feeling right now? You might get one emotion, you might get 5. There's no right or wrong. We just want to start putting those feelings in their individual jars. Once we have identified as much as possible, no one's going to make you take an oath that this is exactly how you're feeling. So once you've identified what you're feeling, the next step is to drop the judgment. Because that is what's going to happen. You're going to identify that you feel afraid or anxious or angry or something. Then you're going to tell yourself that you shouldn't feel that way. That you should feel some other way, like hopeful or excited or grateful or something like that. This is not helpful. And it's also completely optional. Judgment only creates more suffering. I mean, you can kind of set your clock to it. Judgment will always, always, always make you feel worse than the emotion you're already feeling. So if you're feeling afraid and you tell yourself that you should be feeling excited, well, that thought isn't going to magically create the feeling of excitement. No, that's not how it works. You're still going to be feeling afraid, and you're going to be piling on heaps of shame because you tell yourself that you should feel differently. Should is always a building block for shame. Always. Give yourself permission to feel whatever you're feeling, whenever you're feeling it. You're not doing anything wrong. The truth is, you probably are feeling a little bit excited. You probably do feel a little bit grateful. It's just that those emotions are a little bit harder for you to access right now, and that's okay. The last step is to allow yourself the time and space to feel your feelings. It doesn't take long, 3 to 5 minutes. You're going to sit there and you're going to allow the feeling of fear or anxiety or anger or sadness to be there. Again, no judgment. There is no bullying yourself allowed here. I go into great detail on how to do this in the Feel Better Now episode of this podcast. So I would encourage you, that is one to listen to over and over and over because we're never taught how to do this. So the repetition of listening to it more than once will help you develop that habit. Give yourself that time, like you're giving yourself the gift of time and space to really show up for yourself. And that's where I want y'all's heads to start going. How can I really show up for myself in this moment? One of my favorite questions to ask myself when I'm feeling a particularly strong and uncomfortable emotion is, what is the most loving thing that I can do for myself right now? I got to tell you, that question just sifts through all of the bullshit. That's what we're showing up for, ourselves. You have showed up for every other person in your life, your partner, your spouse, your job, your family, your friends. It is time, my beautiful friend, to show up for you. You know exactly how to take care of yourself. When my clients tell me that they don't know how they would handle something happening, I call BS. And in a very loving way, of course, because we always, always, always know how to take care of ourselves. It's just that we spend so much time telling ourselves, I don't know, that becomes the barrier. It's like a flood barrier to the rest of your brain. When you stop telling yourself, I don't know, on the other side of that wall, that's where the magic is. The magic is inside each and every one of you. I promise. It's there. In order to access it, you've got to be willing to stop talking to yourself like an asshole. Once that happens, even navigating the roller coaster becomes easier. If this is something you are struggling with, I can help you. Go to my website, www.ivfthiscoaching.com, and book a free mini session with me. 30 minutes of straight coaching. You'll get a chance to see what it's like to work with me, and you get help on something that you've been struggling with. It is a win-win. Okay, my friends, that is what I have for you. Have a beautiful week, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.